All right, welcome back to
Occult of Personality.
Hey, Greg.
Hey, Robert.
Hey, guys.
So for everybody listening, we're lucky enough today, of course, got Frater O on the program, and super excited, Brother Greg Kaminsky of the Occult of Personality podcast. Brother Greg, thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here.
Absolutely. You know, it's probably argued that of the podcasts available in the nature of Gnostic, occult studies, yours is probably the best in that category. You've done an incredible job. I first heard about you from Frater O, who told me about the program, and now I listen to it while I'm at work going through spreadsheets. So,
well, thank you very much. I appreciate the kind words. It's been a lot of work, and there's a lot of great podcasts in that genre. So to be named the top in the field is certainly an honor.
Well, you know, if you search podcasts, Freemasonry, WCY comes up right up there in the first few. And if you search like Gnostic or occult, you're the number one result. So it's really an honor to have you on, especially Frater and I have had some pretty deep conversations, and we've been wanting to have you on for a while. So thanks, definitely.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here. I look forward to it.
Yeah, Greg has an amazing background in the occult, and he's been doing this great podcast that you mentioned earlier. And he's also a Mason at St. John's Lodge in Boston, Massachusetts. It's the oldest running lodge in the United States, founded in 1733. It used to be in the Bunch of Grapes Tavern, supposedly where the Indians from the Boston Tea Party supposedly were seen leaving as well. And they actually have the original bunch of grapes. They used to hang outside the tavern, the brass bunch of grapes that they bring out for installations. And Greg's a very active Mason there in Boston, as well as he's also a student at the Harvard Extension School studying his master's in medieval history. So again, Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Frater O. I really appreciate that.
So let me ask this for context, the listeners out there, if you guys don't know Brother Greg Kaminsky, Occult of Personality is very much structured around the study of occultism and different, and not necessarily, you know, we're going to assume everybody listening understands the term occult as the proper way. But Brother Greg, do you want to go ahead and let us know how long you've been doing the Occult of Personality podcast?
Yeah, it's been about 10 years or so, 9 years properly, but it's been a long journey. The podcast has been coming out at least once a month or so, roughly, that whole time. So it's been a tremendous effort on my part, because I've gone through like a tremendous amount of life changes during that time, as sort of tangential to the podcast, which is kind of cool as well. So occultism, really the study of the manipulation of hidden forces of nature, maybe you could say, and natural philosophy to achieve the ends that the practitioner is intending. So that can take a lot of forms, obviously. You can go back to ancient times and the study of ancient religions and the birth of more modern religions, and we have seen Gnosticism as a philosophical and religious movement, and all sorts of magical practices and religious rites and things, and sort of how it traversed its way into the modern landscape of esoteric orders and different practitioners of various traditions. So I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in it from a more academic angle, I guess you could say, because I find the study of the history of religion, the history of cults, the history of science and philosophy, and how these things have a side that's like you could consider the other, like the hidden side of the modern world that it's built upon, you know, all of this hidden philosophy and esotericism. So I find that really fascinating as well.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is the academic side as well. So many guys get out there and they're reading books and they're doing all these things without actually studying the academic side behind things. It's really no different. These same people will do this thing where they blindly follow religious faith without looking at the historical sense behind it. In that same respect, it's really cool that you're into history behind these things as well. That's really commendable.
Well, thank you. I mean, I feel like it's important for me because I view the study of history as a tool, and I want to use every tool that I have available to me to try to reach what I think of as the truth, if you will. So
right on.
when I try to use my discernment to like attempt to figure out like, well, is it really true that Freemasonry descended from the ancient Egyptians and the Kaminsky builders and so on and so forth? Like, well, can I really follow that trail in historical research? Is it backed up there as well? Because if it is, then we have no problem at all. If it's not, then we have decisions to make, I think. Or I do anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you talked about that because Frater and I have talked many times about the lodge. Specifically, we can just talk about Blue Lodge, for instance, that I personally struggled for a long time when I first joined the fraternity about what exactly my expectations were, what it turned out to be. And then as we move through the line, move through the chairs and become influential, and we start to move the fraternity, maybe in our provincial area, into a realm of, say, something more esoteric, something else than what it is. Without that historical context, are we making Masonry something that it isn't or never was? Is it right that what we're doing, that kind of thing?
Well, I don't know. I think for me, I'm very much like in my head, like intellectual. So I had to satisfy that part of myself because I couldn't accept at face value this mythology that I was handed.
And were you?
I don't mean the King Solomon
Sure.
story. I mean the cathedral builders and back to the Kaminsky builders and back to the Roman artificers and then back even further and so on. And, the ancient megalith builders of all the great civilizations of the world, or maybe prior to them. So it took a lot of years of digging and research and learning what was really disciplined research and what wasn't, and what I could accept and what I couldn't. And what I've come to realize is that this descent is not necessarily one that was like hand to hand or, mouth to ear, in the sense that these groups all had contact with one another as time flowed. It's much more, I think, of a philosophical descent, the descent of ideas, the descent of technology, and that sort of thing, and the way that flows through mankind and history at the same time. So those links are valid. It's just they may not be valid in the way that some people present them. And I think it's just, for me, like a maturation process to kind of understand that.
Well, what do you think, Frater?
Well, that's a really good question. The game of telephone's a really interesting game. If you ever have sat around with a bunch of people when you were a kid and pass around the simple idea or story or just a simple sentence and, see where that story and how it would end up in just a matter of minutes through, it could be 3 or 4 people, or it could be through 20 or 50 people, depending on how big of a chain of this game of telephone. And, it seems that it has a lot of this original remnants, but it seems like there's a lot of fluff that's been added onto it. And that's okay. That's just a matter of time. And through every allegory or every system, you consistently see over and over and over. But ultimately, Masonry has a lot of value still in today's world. A lot of things that can be applied to in the individual.
I think also is like, what is your standard of evidence? Because most people may not have the same standard of evidence that I do or that you do. So, and most people may not care to get into the weeds and totally geek out over this stuff the way I like to. I mean, for the most part, a lot of the legends and the myths and the things, about the ancient builders and Masonry, and I think also about the Knights Templar and Masonry there's a lot of validity to those connections. You know, if you want to get down, can I prove it? You know, no, but there's enough philosophical proof. I think there's enough evidence that it's convincing, you know, because it's just overwhelming. You just amass enough of it and it becomes kind of overwhelming, I think.
Absolutely. You know, sometimes it's something to be said to use lack of a better allegory, I guess you could say, is occasionally something just gets too big to understand the universe of it all. I like to joke that Masonry sometimes is like Doctor Who. I can't get into Doctor Who the series because it's just too big, and I like to stay in my little Star Trek world and where the information is manageable. For me, Masonry takes so many turns, and there's so many different facets of it where you hear, obviously, there's all this surface stuff that we say in ritual, and there are the Masons who will tell you that this story is just from, you know, this part of the Bible or this part of this book, and ultimately that's their proof and that's where it ends. But what's your thought on, I guess, as far as the origin of Masonry is, if you would entertain us with it? For me, I feel like Masonry basically gets a hand from several different organizations, and it kind of has always been around in the sense of, I looked at like the operative lodges of medieval times and kind of look at it and go, well, probably been that way for a long time, and because of the way the society operates, it has probably brought other organizations and other teachings in. It's been blended in over time to be what it is today. But that's because I also am not a mega scholar on the actual history of Masonry. You know, you're studying your master's in medieval history and things like that. Has that influenced your opinion on Masonry's origins or anything?
Yeah, it definitely has. Because the way I look at it now is that if I were presenting the history of Masonry in that way, I wouldn't present it as factual. You know, I think it should be clear that this is like a mythology, and not in the sense that a myth is false, in the sense that a myth is kind of a way of conveying information symbolically. Sure. and using these groups, because all of them, as you said, Masonry's syncretic in its nature in a lot of ways. If you break it down, you can find influences from all over the place in all sorts of different, more ancient esoteric systems, even non-esoteric streams of knowledge that flow into Masonry. And this mythology kind of represents that all of these groups were the forerunners of the Masons, and that's who the real Masons were in the ancient times. And it's, I think, a good way of representing that these are the streams of knowledge that Freemasonry has incorporated into itself, beginning, I don't know, maybe recognizably in some form in, like, you know, ancient England, like 9th or 10th century, something like that, Common Era. But beyond that, trying to like really have any evidence that there was like even operative lodges in like Roman times. You had the Collegium, but we don't have any real indication, I don't think, of was there ritual similar or not. You know, maybe it was, but we don't. That's where it starts to break down. You get so far back, you know, all you've got are these big megaliths. So, and if nothing else, you could claim, well, heritage with whoever built these things, because they were the great builders of their world, and Masons are the great builders of our world. So the analogy works.
So Frater has always had this kind of interesting theory about these groups that kind of pop up throughout the ages and maybe just kind of change names. You want to talk a little bit about that for a second?
Well, I mean, if you dig enough, you can always see these throughout times. There's always these spikes through history of uprisings or organizations backed behind revolutions, so to speak, and this hidden hand, or this invisible organization behind the scenes that pulls these strings. And I'm sure, Greg, you can also attest to this. It's usually like Templar groups or Malta groups or Masonic groups or Rosicrucian groups or orders that are usually deep and philosophical in nature.
Yeah, what I would call is I don't mean to interrupt you because I agree completely with what you're saying. I would term them as Gnostic groups, and I mean Gnostic in the sense that they have this idea of the like the lesser God and the greater God. The lesser God being man, right, and the greater God being like this idea of like man and God and all men and all this stuff like united in this idea of unity. And these groups are, like you said, they continue to spring up throughout history, and they're usually inspired by a single person who's like a saint or mystic or some sort of realized being.
It's interesting too that Freemasonry itself is one of those old orders on the bookshelf, so to speak, and there's current orders in play in the universe that are maybe working towards a greater good, and not to go conspiracy, but Anonymous is an interesting group too in this day and age, and there's been some papers published in regards to it kind of being more of a Masonic in nature kind of idea. If you look at what a lot of the brothers that stood for things back in the 1700s, he posts from England, and then where they're currently at, or a lot of these supposedly hacking groups that, because everything right now in history, the majority of it's gone online, right? We're doing this show online as well, and that's one amazing form of communication to control information. So there's been these interesting papers that have been brought up opposing those ideas, as well as there's other orders that people can go into as well. How do you feel about this Masonry or Freemasonry being an older, archaic order that's on the bookshelf of history that served its purpose?
I would say that Masonry, like other esoteric orders that are in existence, serve some purpose, or they wouldn't be in existence at all. They're connected with the eternal. So the question kind of is difficult to even really answer properly. I see a lot of these groups as kind of like bastions of the eternal, in the time stream of our lives, or however you want to put it. Freemasonry just has much more mass than most.
Right. Yeah, it's more, largely in the public, it's viewed with more validity. Let me ask you, anybody who's listened to your show knows that your show is not necessarily Masonic. You go into all realms of esoteric. To the modern Mason, the term esoteric to a lot of guys is pretty well known. But I would, and I'm going to just go out on a limb here and say that there are a ton of brothers out there who don't know what the term esoteric means. In fact, it's a new concept to them, introduced to them by their latest candidates, which is it's interesting. But in that realm of esoteric kind of groups, things like that, I've noticed, you've had the last few episodes, you've had a lot of talk about the OTO and Thelema, things like that. We've never really talked about those groups on this show. What is your take on groups like OTO or groups like Golden Dawn, some of the other quasi-Masonic groups?
I think they all have their place and serve their purpose. So like Golden Dawn, for instance, was founded by Masons, specifically members of the SRIA in England. It's co-ed, so that's an important thing to, I think, make note of. The tradition is still in existence today, despite the fact that a lot of their rituals and papers have been published openly. They have a lot of members, as far as I'm aware, all over the world, and temples that are in operation even now. So I think, then on the other hand, you have OTO, which is more of more Masonic than Golden Dawn. I would say Golden Dawn is more of like a magical group. They follow like the Tree of Life grade structure, or like a Rosicrucian grade structure, if you will. The OTO is more Masonic. They have more of like a Masonic grade structure, and they don't have like they have the Gnostic Mass, but other than like initiatory rites, they don't have really like specific magical happenings that are part of the order itself, as far as I'm aware. I could be totally off base in terms of that, but I would say it's like a quasi-Masonic, but its emphasis is really on the philosophy of Thelema. Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will, which is promulgated initially by Aleister Crowley, but is also can be seen as much more ancient than that in a lot of ways. It's a lot about helping people to realize their, what they, maybe call inner potential, or realize their full potential or true will, or do what they're here to do on this planet in this lifetime. So they're like, I think they have like very different purposes. They all have their place. And I think in terms of what Masons can get out of like these other groups is, like you said, more of a direct experience with esoteric philosophy and practice, and individuals that are more open and in discussion about those things, because they're going to be actually engaging in those practices together in some form.
So this brings me kind of to another question, and I'll open this up to Frater first and then get your thoughts on it afterward. And the question is, do you think that those groups have received, speaking of the Golden Dawn, or OTO, do you think those groups have received an influx of membership because of, we'll call it, failure to meet that need in a Blue Lodge?
I really can't answer on that question, is because I'm not a member of both of those orders. I have no clue. There's very few brothers I've met or that I know. There's only a handful that are active in those areas. How do you feel about it? I mean, do you see, or do you hear from the people you interview and the circles that you're in much deeper areas than myself or RJ? Do you see that transition of a lot of the people not quenching their thirst in Masonry going over there?
Yes and no. And there's several layers there's a lot of subtlety to this question and understanding this, the way I understand it. The first way I would say is, like, on surface level, yes, that's exactly what's happening. People who are Masons who then join these other groups are definitely looking for more of a esoteric experience. However, what you find is that, and I have to preface this by saying I did this in the reverse order. So I was initiated into an esoteric fraternity. To go into these more esoteric lodges will find that it actually will improve their understanding of Freemasonry. That's my experience of it, and I think other people would agree with that. So it actually enhances the Masonic experience and appreciation for it in a lot of ways, because you get to see the true elegance and the mastery of Masonic ritual, because you get to compare it, to other things and see it in action and how it works compared to other things and how those work. And I think when you get that opportunity, Masonry becomes even more special. And then there's this other aspect, which is, esotericism has a lot to do with sort of the intention behind what you're doing on the outward level, in the ritual and the symbol, and what it means to you, and then what's happening inside of you. So when you can appreciate Freemasonry and you can appreciate other esoteric systems, what begins to happen is you see how all of these systems are merely representations of inner processes that are happening, and that's when the real magic starts.
That's really super interesting that you brought that up, because it's something that Frater and I have talked about many times. To kind of break that down to my level, for the listeners, if you kind of don't understand, I think what Greg is trying to say is that there's a purpose for every kind of movement and thing that happens in the Blue Lodge that corresponds to an idea of something happening to you on the inside. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. And I don't want to, say anything that I shouldn't. But brothers who are listening who want to better understand what I'm trying to say, and I apologize, because it's really using language to describe something that it's really indescribable. But for instance, like if you sit through the opening of Blue Lodge, every line that's spoken and every movement that's made in the opening corresponds with not only the day or the seasons, but also human consciousness. So that's just like one level of the inner representation of what's going on.
Yeah, super interesting. And this was a topic that Frater had actually suggested, was talking a little bit about consciousness streams and things of that nature going as it regards to the Blue Lodge, or just in Masonry, symbolic Masonry in general. Frater, you want to kind of expound on that a little bit?
Greg, I know this will wet your whistle, and there's always maps of consciousness that can be found. You can find that in layouts and architecture of cities, to layouts of many different holy sites and temples, regardless of any really dogma, to even layouts of King Solomon's temple or ancient sites. And you can always find this through the I Ching or alchemy or realism or the Kabbalah, and Freemasonry definitely lumps into that idea of that. We use the term veiled in allegory, illustrated in symbolism, and it's, you mentioned it earlier, is when you get into words become a dumbing down and become a harder word to transfer that information. And Masonry does a very crafty and clever job to present the candidate and being part of the play or part of a lot of people will call it ritual, to help them uncover it versus them being told it or trying to recite it or trying to read about it or watch a film. They literally bring it around you in a sense that makes it much more of an impact to the subconscious or even to the conscious. How do you feel about Masonry being the map of consciousness? And please, kind of grab that and run with it by all means. Go as deep as possible.
Yeah. I think that's really important point about maps of consciousness. The one thing I would say is that yes, it is a map of consciousness. I love the way Nisargadatta describes it. He's like, you're in a prison and all these systems are like escape plans, right? All these different esoteric, mystical systems are like escape plans because your situation's totally, completely untenable, right? You have all these worldly desires and then you satisfy them and you're still not happy.
Right.
You're just more and more miserable, right? So you need an escape, right? How do you do that? So there's all these maps of how to get out of the prison. And what he says is that it doesn't really matter, because none of the plans are exactly accurate, because they can't be, because they're only symbolic. What matters most is how much you apply yourself and that you trust that the plan will get you to where you want to go. Because once you get there, you don't need it anymore. It's not important. You know what I mean?
And that's the end of the show, guys. Brother Greg just gave away the entire secret of life right there. That's it. It's done. It's been great. Thanks, everybody.
Well, I mean, it's like the what do they say? Masonry's taking good men and making them better, right? It's not about making them better Freemasons. It's about making better men.
You hear that, ritual vultures?
Now, maybe you need to be a better Mason to be a better man. That may very well be the case.
Possibly.
But so the map of consciousness that Masonry presents is really great because you can get to see the map played out from so many different perspectives, right? You see it first as a candidate, then you see it from the sidelines, and then hopefully you see it from each chair in position around, all the way to past master. And I think one of the things that kind of conveys is that idea about the eternal represented in time. It's also, if you can imagine, like that journey in Masonry and then being presented with this map of consciousness. It very much to me alludes to the whole idea of like a play where, you know, we take ourselves to be a human being, but we're really on a different level, way back behind it all, like this witness watching the whole play being played out. And I don't just mean in lodge, I mean just in reality itself. And that's kind of the level that I think Freemasonry really touches on a like sort of deep subconscious way. You know, when you sit there and repeatedly see the ritual done over and over again, the initiations, and you get to see it from different places, participate in it or not. That's been my experience.
Very interesting points for sure.
Man, you just that was some really deep stuff, and man, where do you go from there? You just kind of that's it. You put it in a great box and you packaged it and you brought it out and you said it in such amazing words for so many people on so many levels, regardless if they're not a Mason or if they're an entered apprentice or even the past master that hasn't really dove into these topics. So you're able to nicely touch on all those different aspects.
So let me ask this. I started Whence Came You because I didn't get education in lodge, and I was listening to the Digital Freemason, and I loved some of the things that he was doing. And that was my first exposure to Masonry. Like, I had no idea that you could just go out there and research facts like this, right? Like, I had no idea. That's why I started reading papers and stuff. And this show has primarily focused, you know, in the first year and a half, really on Masonry, its foundations, historical values, some mythological lore, things of that nature. And only in the last, I'd say, year have we really focused on adding a serious esoteric touch to the program. And this was in large part because of the demand of the listener. And so over the years, you know, I've got 2.5 years or so of building my own knowledge of the historical and mythological lore, because that's what we focused on. I really was using the show as a means to increase my Masonic knowledge. And then if somebody out there was A, too lazy to, or B, didn't have the time to, well, let me just read that stuff for them and they can get that same knowledge, you know, might as well, right? I mean, if I'm going to read it out loud, let somebody else hear it. And I found that my knowledge increased, 120%. When you were into, were you doing Occult of Personality before you got into kind of esoteric systems, or after? And did it do the kind of the same thing? Did it just like blow your mind after all these years? Have you learned, tenfold?
Oh yeah. I started it because I started the podcast because I felt like I had so many questions that I wanted to ask people. And when it came down to it, a lot of the questions I wanted to ask to people who I thought were in the best position to answer the question.
Sure, yeah, it makes sense.
So I figured what better way than to record it and put it online, and that way, I get educated, they can get publicity or whatever they're, selling or whatever, and people listening can benefit from it too. So it kind of worked out. And I was interested in things like astrotheology, sacred geometry, ancient civilizations, and ancient religion and symbolism and things of that nature. And I was also interested in how those ideas kind of interfaced with modern life or modern times, because, there's different ways that they do. Like one is like conspiracy theory, another is like the Western esoteric tradition, and there's others, but they're all a lot more closely related than I realized at first. And that may be distressing to people or not. I don't know. Maybe they're on board with that idea too. Yeah, so that's how I kind of started interested in those topics, and gradually found myself completely and utterly drawn in by this idea that you had people throughout history who, whether they were religious ideas or whether they were humanistic ideas, they generally were interested in figuring out how humanity and divinity existed together and could communicate with one another, maybe. And then, from there, interest in all sorts of things like magic and alchemy and astrology and Kabbalah. And from there, of course, Masonry is like just, very close on the heels of all of those things, historically. So esoteric orders and this idea of secrecy, and then, what is this, what is all of this stuff really about? And it took me a while to kind of even come to grips with where is it all going? What is the real aim of all this stuff? Because it's not sort of presented up front the way it is in Eastern systems, I don't think.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you. I definitely went through a point when I just didn't know what to make of it. I was a master mason. I was in the line of my lodge. I had been initiated into other outside orders as well, but ultimately that's kind of was my interest also when I started diving into kind of occult studies, primarily Gnostic Christian ideas. And that's the thing too, is, I just found an interest there, but I found myself questioning what's the purpose to all of this if, my experience is XYZ, if it's not what made, how do I even say this? If my expectations weren't met with what I thought I would find, how do I dive further, and where do I go for those answers? How do I find the connection to Masonry to make it so that I don't feel like Masonry wasn't needed? Do you know what I mean?
I think so.
I didn't want to say Masonry just doesn't matter. Like, it opened my eyes to something, but ultimately, if I had just read a book, like, I would have got the same thing. That was
I think one thing I would say in response to that is that Masonry involves initiatory experience, which means that processes are being invoked, meaning they're being started, with this initiatory process that are, within the individual. It's like planting a seed, and then going through the degrees, learning, feeling like there's not that much value there. All these kind of experiences as along the way are just sort of nurturing that seed, and later on it will bloom. That's the system. If you have faith in the system and you follow through with it, I would argue that it doesn't really matter that one feels sort of disgruntled with Masonry, or that Masonry doesn't satisfy that itch that they were hoping it would, because the processes that Masonry is working with are subtle, and they're slow, and they take time, and you have to work with them, and you have to be patient. And it's like, think of the gardening, or the analogy of alchemy, or the motion of the stars and planets. This stuff takes time to work. It's magic. But when it works, and you can't deny it. And I think people who've had that experience, they look back, and it's, when I look back, I realize that all of the mistakes and the times I felt unhappy or displeased, or that I was suffering through this disconnect between what I thought something should be and what it really was, that was all just grist for the mill. That was all part of what was going on in the process to get me to a place, to get to smooth that ashlar.
Right. I think I know what you're saying. I mean, it's like I tell my kids all the time. They said, Dad, why do bad things happen all the time? Like, why is this disappointing, or this, that, and the other happen? And kind of my way of explaining things is, your life isn't complete until you've experienced every emotion possible, every nuance that life has to offer. So the way you
that's a great way to put
it. The way you describe all those experiences having to culminate into something greater and nurturing that seed kind of brings me back to Frater O's point about the emotions and the way they interact on the consciousness, kind of tying it back to that.
The third degree is a beautiful degree, and it represents so much to the candidate. And, I know oaths, and I'm not going to go into detail, but it was probably one of the most profound experiences I went through. And then after going through it, sitting back and watching it and seeing so much more, is because it's like drinking through a fire hose. And when you sit back and look at it and just have that realization going, wow, it's right there. And it might not happen the first time or second time or the fifth or eighth, or whenever you come to that understanding is important, and it's right for you, whoever you are listening, that's for you and for you alone to figure out. And every person's different, and that's the beautiful part of this human experience. And when you're able to have that understanding, you have an amazing appreciation for so much more and how it's been represented to you. And I know that sounds very cryptic, and I'm trying to just carefully and delicately say things. And now for the degrees, for crossing over that idea on the spiritual aspect, or from the visible to the invisible, which degrees for the two of you, Greg, I'll have you go first, was the most significant for that?
This, in terms of like crossing from the spiritual or the material to the spiritual?
Yeah, to the conscious to the subconscious, or the understanding of that veil of the map, so to speak.
Wow. I don't know how you would pick one of those degrees. Like,
or you don't have to pick one. Just what was the most, like, for you, that has like the most vivid memory? Was it more being a candidate, or was it more sitting back and watching it after you went through the three?
And to ask
I think it was definitely being a candidate for me.
Let me just kind of further the thought, though. Are we talking about just first 3 degrees of Masonry? Is that what we're talking about?
We can go anywhere. I mean,
okay.
Do you want to go
I
to Scott?
I wanted to clarify that while I listen to Brother Greg.
I mean, I would say for me, haven't seen all that many beyond the first 3, so I would qualify it. I've seen non-Masonic degrees and experienced those. I would say the first 3 degrees, the Blue Lodge degrees, were, to me, the most impactful. They all had truly memorable, magical moments. It would be hard to pick one that was more of an impact than the others. Although, the 3rd degree, I think, kind of has to be, just because it's the sublime degree itself. So if you had to pick one, that would be it. But the experience I had, granted, maybe I shouldn't assume other people have had a similar experience. I mean, I'm a member of St. John's Lodge in Boston. We meet in the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts building in Corinthian Hall usually, which is a just gorgeous room, and the ritual's done just exactly perfect. And, it's just amazing. I've never seen a more magical ritual done more effectively than that. Whether people thought that that's what they were doing or not. Right.
Well, I mean, you definitely have that. I mean, before I kind of go into my thoughts on it, there is that idea that what other people are doing, if you're of this mindset, what other people are doing for you, they may have no idea of what they're actually doing for you.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think it's important to note, the people who wrote those words and worked out the floor work, what was their intention behind it? Because I think the person acting it out may not have much of their own idea or thought on the matter, but somebody who composed it, I guarantee you, did.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would have to definitely agree with you. Frater and I have, again, we've talked many times about why certain chairs do certain things, and, all those things, they've all been accounted for, essentially. About degrees, eye-openings, I think the first degree, I had a moment, as Brother Greg pointed out, every degree had something so special that stood out. And I remember the eye-opening part for me was in the first degree when I was at the altar. And as we say, given light, right? I had this moment where I'm sure there was ritual going on, and I can't remember. I mean, I know what was said now because I've done it, but at that moment, like, everything was silent, and all I kept thinking was, holy shit. I just joined the Freemasons. This is real. And in the second degree, I remember thinking, it solidified the reality to me of symbolism because of, we have a lecture called the Middle Chamber Lecture, or the Senior Deacon's Lecture, whatever you want to call it. And the amount of information pooled in that lecture hit me like a ton of bricks. The symbolic, like, immediately when we tell people that we are a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols, here I am being shown these symbols on a tracing board, and I'm told a story to connect them all, but the morality or the hidden lessons behind it didn't hit me until much later. And when they did, it was another holy cow moment. And so, you have these moments, but the transcendent kind of into the spiritual side of things, I think happened to me, not at my own third degree, but I think performing it for somebody else, giving that obligation to somebody and being, I suppose, master ceremonies for the degree. I think that's when I kind of realized the nature of what we were doing. And it was only because I heard somebody say something about, make sure this happens, and this happens because it has to be just perfect. And then I thought about it for a second, and it does have to be perfect because we're doing this for the first time, for the last time for them. Let's not screw it up. And you have to understand that you're doing something and unlocking something for them, and that should be kind of treated, I think, as definitely some solemnity to it. And that was kind of a spiritual, I think, moment for me. And realizing,
I think that's an interesting point you bring up about the ritual, because I had one of those kind of breakthrough moments. I think I was more watching the ritual than anything, but what really struck me was, in terms of doing it exactly right, that you have a template you're working with. Mm-hmm. And that's your standard. And you think of how many times that motion or movement has been made on the floor, and those words have been spoken in that exact spot to somebody, for that exact purpose, repeated over and over and over again, because the continuation of that tradition is, what makes that lineage so strong, because it is held to that standard. It's, every movement, every word, every action has to be perfect. And the more that it is up to that standard, I think the more effective it is, because everybody who performs it knows it, and the candidate knows it. And on a level below the superficial, I think we can all feel it when it's done perfectly. It just transmits something eternal, really. It's something, when that lodge room is tiled, what happens in there in terms of ritual is, it's like stepping outside of time.
Yeah, I would have to definitely agree. Looking at ritual like that and making sure it's done proper, to me anyway, it really feels like a recipe. And, people will argue that it doesn't have, again, I joke about ritual vultures and things like that, but there is an amount of things that really should be done just so, because it is, in fact, a recipe for enlightenment, and it's like a souffle, right? You put it in the oven. You don't want to jump up and down in the kitchen when you're making a souffle, because it's going to fall.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I think about is that the emphasis is really on like a personal connection with ourselves, with our brothers, with Masonry as a tradition, and with the great architect of the universe, if you will. So it's got this, I don't want to use like religious language, but
sure,
it does have this kind of holy purpose where it's like the attempted perfection of the individual using this system. So there's this huge aspect to it that is spiritual.
Absolutely. When you go through the degrees and you walk in those same footsteps as many people have done before, which Greg mentioned on, and knowing that so many powerful people throughout history have walked in those same exact footsteps is a very remarkable feeling to go through. And those same people that have changed history for the greater good and for the better throughout time after time after time. And knowing that they heard the exact phrase or very similar phrase, depending on states or countries, of course, and knowing that there's a lot more to this is it's a unique feeling. But it also raises the bar inside of yourself, knowing that this fraternity is tied to so many of these individuals that have literally changed themselves for the better, and then in return, by changing themselves internally, have made a massive change in the macrocosm and the external, and to help humanity progress.
So I guess I want to touch on, I'm dying to ask you guys this question, because this is a loaded question straight off the bat. I will admit this right up front. And if you don't want to answer it, it's totally fine. But there's a lot of talk about the way Masonry runs on state levels. And I don't want to get into the politics of it, but what do you think in terms of the candidate's experience, if the candidate is looking for quality kind of thing that we were looking for, I mean, of course, we all had differences in things we were looking for, but in general, some kind of esoteric or spiritual enlightenment, or whatever you want to call that. Do you think that, like, Grandmaster's classes is where I'm going with this? I mean, where a bunch of Masons are made Masons in a day, I don't see anything particularly wrong with that, except when there are shortcuts being made instead of an individual experiencing things, he's watching. Do you think that the esoteric Mason loses anything? Again, that's going to be an individual question. I mean, you might have to ask an esoteric Mason, but I've hung out with some Masons over drinks, and when we talk about a blue lightning, his exact words were, and that's what we term it here in Illinois, as a blue lightning, make you a blue Mason as fast as lightning, I guess is the term. He has said, yes, I too was a victim of the blue lightning. The term victim in that sense was interesting to me. What do you guys think about that? I mean, as far as the esoteric and the experience not exactly having that initiatic experience.
Like most things, I kind of see it in two different ways, at least. The first is I agree that it definitely shortchanges the initiate or the candidate in that instance. Not being able to experience the actual initiation does leave a lot to be desired. However, I also believe that the human mind is capable of sort of watching someone else experience the initiation and kind of internalizing that process subconsciously, so the same effects can be gleaned from it. The other thing is that, there's two sides to this. It's not just all about the candidate. There's a lot of work and other people involved in the initiation, and they benefit from these things, even if the people being initiated don't as much. So I would also, weigh that out. I mean, I don't think they're just doing this because it's cool or because they can do it. I'm assuming it's because membership is, there's a need for them to get as many people in
Sure.
as fast as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So I would say that for even for people who go through that type of experience, I went through that for Royal Arch chapter, and it left a lot to be desired, but ultimately I still think I got a lot out of those degrees anyway. So It wasn't a total loss. It's just not optimal, I guess.
I would tend to agree with you. What are your thoughts, Frater?
Well, if you look throughout history and you look at in the 1700s with the original degrees, what was taught at each degree was very significant. And the first degree is very significant because it teaches you I'm trying to be very cautious here with my words, on how to better yourself and how important it is to take these certain steps before you progress. And sometimes that takes a while. For myself, I took it literal. I applied it. It took me 5 years between my first and my second. I took and applied what was taught to me and literally worked those demons out of myself. And it wasn't easy until I figured that out and went, okay, now I'm ready for step 2. And nowadays, it's just jammed down your throat like a fire hose. And if you go into London, or if you especially go to Italy, they take it very seriously for each degree. Sometimes it takes 1 year, 5 years, 3 years for each person to find that, to literally embody those ideas inside themselves versus just watch it, acknowledge it, and move forward. And it's the same thing when you get to South America in the Scottish Rite degrees. So many brothers come up here to get their 32nd in a one-day class versus if you were down in South America, it would literally take you 10 plus years to get there, because each, continuing on from Blue Lodge, which takes a while, I don't know the exact years, but it takes so long to progress to each level because you have to prove to the lodge that you are embodying these ideas or these things, what's been spoken to you or taught to you, and you're literally applying that, which it seems there's a disconnect here.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that type of masonry is, I mean, if I had to pick, I would certainly rather see like smaller lodges, longer to go through the degrees, like more philosophical discussions, really working through the moral lessons of the degrees and to seeing how that all really works on a person. And because I think that's really the experience of Masonry, because that's the internal experience of Masonry. I don't know if it's ever been like that in this country. Our tradition of Masonry is, I think, it's not that people don't, as you said, you've actually done this work yourself, and I think we've all, to some extent, kind of done that work, even though it wasn't in a structured format through the lodge. Maybe that's one of the great things about this system of Freemasonry is that once presented to an individual, they have the freedom to take it and run with it and use it to their benefit, or not, as the case may be. But they, even to people who go through the degrees and don't come back, they've still gotten sort of taste of, what was once sort of much more glorious, sort of ancient mystery tradition, and all of the things that go along with that. Even if they don't appreciate it, I think it's still beneficial.
What about you, RJ? I mean, how do you fall on this system with the whole idea of the blue lightning?
I've got so many friends who have gone through blue lightnings and made excellent Masons and have taken the time to sit back, reflect, and do the work, as you call it. And because of that, I think, if anything, experiencing it the way they did perhaps could be like given the keys to the car and said, okay, here you go. Perhaps likened to a traditional style 1, 2, 3 over the course of a couple months or a year, whatever. Might be more along the lines of, here are the keys to the car, and also let me hop in with you and show you how this thing works a little bit. I think ultimately after 10 years of driving, both probably have some good experiences as long as you're driving, or that is, as long as you're in Masonry and you're working, you're probably somewhere around the same, I don't want to call it level, grade, whatever. Your knowledge, your experience, your understanding, the things that you have applied to your life on both sides are probably pretty comparable. The demons you've tamed, all these things. But again, there are those who become Masons to just be a Mason, and for that purpose, I guess in that context of where that happens, a gentleman might join the fraternity for networking or social reasons or because of a curiosity, and he never goes back, and he pays his dues the first time, and after that maybe he goes on a list of guys who haven't paid in years and he's inactive and whatever. I guess I don't see a problem with that either, because what does it hurt in the sense that he's out there and he's just not coming to lodge? I don't really have a feeling one way or the other. I mean, I used to be adamantly against the Blue Lightning experience only because I think it cheated. I felt that it cheated the candidate. And then you look internally and maybe there is some possible animosity you feel because what it took you months or a year, 2 years to do, they did in about 5 hours. You had to prove yourself by learning these catechisms and all this stuff, and many of those qualifications have largely been dropped from what we call Grand Masters classes or Blue Lightnings. Here in Illinois, in order to participate, you have to have received the first degree and have returned the first degree catechism before you can be a candidate for a second and third degree master's class. And here we are today. On September 19th of this year, 2015, I will be having a Blue Lightning event at my lodge for 15 individuals who have been EAs for forever and a day, and they just haven't had the time to do so. To finish it up for whatever reason. I mean, I'm not here to judge anybody's time or anything. I think people kind of tend to make time for what they either have to make time for or need to make time for. So to each their own. But I do like what Brother Greg had said earlier about one's ability to process what they've seen and internalize those lessons that they're seeing, right off the bat. They get to start working on it. In some respects, it might even be a benefit to them, because after you receive a first degree, how long will it be until you get to watch one and experience it from that second level? So you might be kind of getting both at the same time, and you might come out with a different view, perhaps.
I think that when candidates are received into the lodge, they're at vastly different levels of preparation and their level of ability to interpret what they're being shown on everybody can internalize it subconsciously, but only the candidates who have duly and truly prepared themselves through like a lot of study beforehand will be able to recognize the value of what they're being shown right off the bat, I think.
Yeah.
It's pretty rare in my experience that people walk in the door and they're like, holy shit, wow, can't believe what just happened here. Because usually the reaction is like, that's it? What? Huh?
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I've had one or two people who have gone through the degrees, and after the meeting, they've come to me and they've said, I noticed this, and this. I have these questions. Can you help me answer them? Yeah, heck yeah, let's go have a beer, dude. Let's go, right now. And that's so rare, and I get really geeked out and excited over it because now we get to do something. On the other hand, I do have candidates that, at the end of a degree or whatever else will say, hey, it's your time. You have the floor. Say what you want to say about whatever. And I've had candidates say before, wow, not what I was expecting. I have a lot to learn. And that's it, Mm-hmm. And they're dying to watch a first degree now, or whatever the case may be. But yeah, I don't know. Have you, Fratero, have you experienced many Masons that came through the door, rip roaring to go, like already knew tons of allegory and stuff before they even got their degree?
There's a handful. Have I sat and watched them go through the degrees and then been there like a fly on the wall and be able to help them through the process like you have? No. But when you start pursuing a certain path, or if you start getting a certain mindset, it's very interesting what you can attract to yourself. And it seems that when you start going down these esoteric paths, usually you start to attract or start to go after like-minded individuals. Hence how both of us, Greg and RJ, we've all met, and it seems like it's usually those people that have done the work before, or who are really want to apply themselves. And that can be seen about in any aspect with universities or careers or being a family member and wanting to move forward. So there's only a handful. And I mean, I could literally count that, probably like under 10 people that I've met. And I've been fortunate in my travels to meet a lot of people. And that's fine. Masonry presents so much, and there needs to be these people or these brothers there to be able to pass this information down, even though they memorize these amazingly long esoteric passages and don't understand it, but maybe that person on the other end understands it, then they did their job, or they served their purpose in this massive beehive, so to speak. So I have not. But Greg, have you, turning the question over to you, have you met any brothers along those lines?
I've met a few, for sure, who kind of realized the implications of what they were seeing, and but it is definitely not the average Mason. I think more of my experience has been like when I went in the first degree and I turned to the guy next to me who was also a candidate, and I was in a college fraternity, and I'd been through another esoteric fraternal or initiations and things, and I was like, do you have any idea what's about to happen? And he said no, and I was like, oh, well, you better prepare yourself then. and he was just like, well, what's going to happen? I was like, well, I can't tell you, but if only you knew, you'd be much more excited than you are at the moment.
Sure, yeah. Well, like I was going to say, you had alluded to earlier that, you too had been through something prior to joining the lodge. Did you find yourself better inclined to understand the things you were seeing?
Yeah, and I want to be clear, like most every Western esoteric order, fraternity, society, whatever, is strongly influenced by Masonic philosophy and ritual, even if they're not Masonic or even quasi-Masonic. They'll still borrow. You could say they're borrowing elements of Masonic ritual, or, if saw it differently, you could say that they're just drawing from the same well that Masonry does of the Western esoteric tradition.
Sure.
You're kind of like picking hairs at that point. But, so in a sense, if you've experienced, esoteric initiation, college fraternal initiation, Freemasonry initiation, you're going to see elements that are very similar amongst all of them.
Very true.
Preparing yourself before the first degree. When you're really on a deep philosophical path and you're asking those really deep questions of Why are we here? Where do we come from? What is my purpose in life? You tend to kind of gravitate to what's around you and pull towards it. And before I jumped into the entered apprentice degree, I was starting to ask those questions, but I really didn't I really was like fascinated by Masonry. I knew a lot of people were interested in Masonry in my first degree. So I didn't really dive deep until I started doing the work after I was taught the first degree. And then I really jumped into those 3 questions and started learning, meditation techniques and studying shamanism and studying alchemy and then getting into the aspects of the Western occultism and then getting into the Eastern aspects of certain aspects of Taoism or Hinduism, and then trying to apply those meditation techniques internally and trying to what they would call achieve Christ consciousness or try to achieve something greater than myself and seem like, okay, this is a great ride and it's kind of getting boring, not in a sense like it's getting boring, but like there seems to be a lot more here, and what is my true purpose in life?
Sure.
And when you start asking those questions, then I think it brings more out in the initiation or the initiatic experience that you go through in the first 3 degrees, if you're open to those things. And the universe has a funny way of working. If you're open to those things and you're asking those questions, it'll give you the answers. You might have to go searching for those answers, but I'll start laying a cookie crumb trail for you to search for those answers. And some people aren't prepared to receive those answers fully, or if they do, their psyche's not ready. And
that's a really great points you make. I think Freemasonry is one of the why it's so elegant, or one of the reasons it's so elegant is it does actually allude exactly to what you're talking about, because in Freemasonry you go through the ritual as a candidate. You view the ritual from the sidelines. You see and participate in the ritual from each of the chairs, hopefully, right? And if we're talking about an internal journey and sort of that, what is the purpose of all of this type of thing? Well, in the journey to perfect oneself, the candidate can't be the same person who eventually sits in the East. They're different people.
Absolutely.
They're totally different people. And in order to get to the East, all of that all those rough edges have to get chipped off along the way. And what that essentially means is, I think in a much more Eastern philosophical sense, is like you're no longer who you think you are. You have to become that embody that greater being who you have the potential to be. And that's what it's really about. It's about being the master, not about being the candidate or the junior warden or even the senior warden. It's about being the master of your own self.
Yeah, amazing point. I think that's something that a lot of people may fail to see because they're not thinking of it that way. They're not thinking about how they got to where they were, especially in much more. I don't want to say successful lodges in the terms of success is widely defined as many different things. But if you are doing things, I believe, the proper way, going through your chairs and learning what you need to learn per chair, and making your observations and recognizing your internal changes, you most certainly are not the same person you were, as Greg says, on the altar as you are in the East, or even you're not even the same person from senior warden to the East. You go through these, molting stages of betterment. I think even if you weren't aware of it before, listening to this now, if you, next time you go to bed, before you go to bed, think about, contemplate the difference that you've taken over the years. I don't ever feel like maybe I'm the same. I feel like I'm kind of the same person I've always been. My wife will tell you absolutely not. She will tell you up and down every day that I am not the same person she married after I became a Mason and gone through degrees and started studying things for the better. Nothing, she has nothing nothing bad to say about the fraternity. Everything that I've done in the meantime has been bettering myself. So, outside of not being home several times a month.
It's all laid out in the Masonic system. We have to identify ourselves. It's crucial, and we have to identify ourselves with the master builder, and we have to see ourselves in that role and take responsibility for our decisions and the consequences in that role. And I think that because that means abandoning a lot of things that, subduing the passions and things, and it's really important. And it's not just a bunch of moralizing. It's just how the universe works.
Yeah, I kind of think about it as you talk about all these different theories of existence and things, and I always kind of liken it to being able to take a step out of yourself and looking at the world in this third-party view, looking at, as we say, our vices and superfluities and all these different things that are in our way, and going from, I guess, troubled program to programmer is kind of the way I look at it.
Interesting way to say it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is, not, it's just bringing more light, like the whole idea of more light. And that's really, about subduing the passions. It's not really about, I don't, in my opinion, not so much about some kind of puritanical asceticism. It's about bringing more light to your behavior and what you're doing, and not trying to restrict yourself or white knuckle it and, I want this really bad, but I can't because no, that's not how to do it. I mean, it's just about bringing more light to whatever's going on.
So Greg, thanks again for, spending your time here on the show. And for those people that are new into Masonry or looking to pursue deeper aspects of the esoterics and the occult, one is greatly your show. But, to that point, are there things that has helped you or things that you recommend to any other Masons out there along the path?
Yeah, absolutely. First would be to attend lodge as much as possible. And when you're watching the ritual, to try to ask yourself if each chair or each role in this ritual represents an aspect of myself. How does that play out? Well, which aspect is each role, and what are they doing, and what are they trying to represent that's going on within me or within any man or person, really? That would be one thing. There's always books, I find, if you like to read. A lot of Masons like to read about Masonry and history and philosophy and things. I think those are really great resources. If you're looking for something more straight up historical and analytic, I think that new Angel Millar book, Freemasonry, Foundation of the Western Esoteric Tradition, is really good, because that will give you like a historical perspective on Masonry and how it kind of fits in with other esoteric streams, really kind of birthing them in the West. And I find that's pretty interesting. There's another book by a little more controversial, I admit, Robert Sullivan, the Royal Arch of Enoch book, which has a lot of information about Masonry. That he's done a lot of really deep research, and I think that could be a source of knowledge for people that's really excellent. I also like another book that's not Masonic, but it gives a great background in things like ancient religion, symbolism, language, geometry, and that is Jesus Christ, Son of God, S-U-N, which is ancient Christian cosmology and early Christian symbolism, this book. This is an excellent book. I think I'd recommend this to people all the time. Beyond that, there's so many Masonic resources you can go with. But if you're really interested in sort of getting into the esoteric ideas of Masonry, I think it would benefit you greatly to study things like Kabbalah, at least the philosophy and symbolism of alchemy, maybe ceremonial magic, which is sort of a practical extension of Kabbalah in a lot of ways. I think studying those systems can give you a great insight into Masonic ritual and philosophy too. And to that point, I think the books of Timothy Hogan kind of point to a lot of those connections. So those are probably some recommendations that would be easy for people to follow up on.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll have to put some links into the show notes for those, and then we can link them directly to where you can purchase those. So, Brother Greg, you on the side also, within your podcast, which is fantastic, and again, we recommend, and we'll have links to that in the show notes as well. Occult of Personality does have a membership section as well, and if you want to tell us a little bit about that so that we know how to help that show.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that. So Occult of Personality does have a membership section, which is really designed to provide an extension of the publicly available podcasts. So the interviews in the membership section go into greater depth, cover topics that we don't, either because we don't have time to cover in the public podcast, or they require enough background information that it's just too difficult to get into them in the public podcast. So the information's much more in depth. It really is designed as a way for people to get esoteric teachings. They can listen to someone speak and learn about really in-depth topics and subjects that you'd be hard-pressed to hear about in almost any public forum anywhere. These are the type of questions that it takes me a lot of, well, as a podcaster, I'm sure you understand, during the course of an interview, people gradually open up more and more. So after an hour or hour and a half, you get someone who's willing to answer questions that they might not earlier, or give you answers and insights that are more subtle and intricate than would occur earlier in the interview. So it's really trying to distill a lot of that for people, and I think it's a great value. It's a pretty cheap monthly price, and the thing it does is it allows me to continue doing the podcast and providing those free monthly interviews for people, because if it weren't for the membership section, there's no way in the world that I could do this at all. It pays for the hosting, all of my equipment, and if I didn't have the membership section, I would be working much more than I am, and definitely not have time to do this at all. So I very much appreciate all of the people who support the membership section with their subscriptions, and certainly all the guests on the show and all the listeners. It wouldn't be as successful as it is without all those people involved.
So as Brother Greg has said, podcasting in general is something that does take quite a bit of time outside of our normal 40-hour work weeks. So anything you can do to support his show, check out that membership section. Again, links will be in the show notes. And then also, anybody in your area up there might be interested to know that you'll be teaching some classes. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? I know your dates are sketchy at the moment, but if you wanted to let people know about that.
Yeah, I think the first one I know about is I'm doing an Intro to Spiritual Alchemy class at Eternal Balance in Beverly, Massachusetts on Friday, November 6th. That's going to cover the basic introductory philosophy and initial sort of practices of what I call spiritual alchemy. And that's really a meditation, breathing, and some ritual designed to begin a process of spiritual illumination, basically. Beyond that, I'm also planning on teaching a class on the ancient Greek mysteries of Eleusis and Samothrace at the Hermetic Arts Learning Center. That'll also probably be sometime in November. So those dates are going to be available through my Occult of Personality Facebook and Twitter. So if people want to follow up on that, I'm sure that'll be available sometime soon.
Sweet. That sounds awesome. Very
thank
cool.
you.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to say thanks so much for being on the show. It has been Frater and I's something we've been talking about for a while. And I know that busy guy, and I just really do appreciate having you on the program. It really is an honor to have you on. I know the listeners out there really appreciate your insights, especially as somebody who comes to us from an outlet like Occult of Personality that is not, 100% Masonic. They're getting that little bit of an outside view on things, and your unique view on it, and we do appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's really a privilege, and I'm really honored to be here with you tonight, and I'm a fan of your show, and I really enjoy the conversations with Frater O. Definitely, I like it because it makes me think a lot, and I really appreciate Freemasonry and, you know, your podcast and other resources that help me appreciate Masonry are real treasures. So I'm really glad you're doing what you're doing too. So thank you very much.
Awesome. And Frater O, I just want to say thanks again for joining us. Also, I know you're a busy guy, and it's not always easy for us to match our schedules to make something work out. Anybody listening, this almost didn't happen this evening. We missed our shot last Sunday and Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and now it's Saturday, and the show comes out on Sunday at 9:30. So if you're listening to this, I worked hard on this one. I did. I worked hard, and you can help out by definitely going to support the show and picking up a pin or something if you'd like, and links to that also be in the show notes. Frater O, closing thoughts, brother.
Well, it's amazing on how the stars aligned to get all three of us together, and Greg, I'm really fortunate I know speak on behalf of RJ as well, that we're fortunate to have you on, and it's great to be able to connect the two of you, because the two of you are very like-minded individuals, and I'm sure you'll have some very unique fraternal conversations in the future. And thanks again, both of you, for your time, and look forward to the next discussion. Hopefully down the road we can have you back on.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, you know, I really appreciate you connecting us as well. And I feel really blessed to have met you and to call you brother. So this was really great evening, and I hope we can have some more discussions about some even more odd and esoteric things down the road.
Well, sure. You know, I mean, nothing. These esoteric kind of I guess bi-monthly episodes that we're doing are quenching some thirsts. And I think if there's ever topics that might be too masonic for Occult of Personality, and you want to vent about something, or you just want to talk about something in general, you know, you have a floor here, definitely, and we are your audience. So.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you.
So thank you.